When silver was discovered in the Lardeau Valley in the 1890s, the dream of sudden wealth drew thousands to the remote mountain region. They came from American mining camps in the south and from Canadian farms and towns in the east. In the mountainous Lardeau Valley, long strings of pack horses were the mainstay of the transportation system. Of all the men who ran the pack trains, two were renowned, Red McLeod and Andy Daney. Both were packers by trade, but it would be hard to find two men so different. A century later, these two remain legends of the Lardeau. Red McLeod. Born in Lancaster, Ontario in 1868, he traveled west as a young man and joined the mounted police during the Riel Rebellion, then moved on to drive Red River carts from Edmonton to Calgary. He punched cows and traded horses in Montana, and from there he came north into British Columbia. When Red came to the Lardeau, the valley was filled with excitement. It was 1898, and everybody was prospecting for silver. People were coming and going with each new discovery of ore, and steamboats were busy on the lake. There was even talk of building 2 railways up the valley. Well, Red and some friends found a vein of silver up on Lavina Peak, but Red wasn't a prospector. And for a while, Red ran the old hotel in Argenta, but Red wasn't a hotel keeper either. What Red was a thief. Not an ordinary thief, but a Robin Hood of the Lardeau.
Oh, Red McLeod, yes. Red was a real mountain man, but I came to the conclusion that he was a kleptomaniac, that he could not help stealing. One time he was in Lardeau, some men came out of the hills and had a yen for a feed of chicken. And there were no chickens in Lardeau. Red helped himself to a rowboat, rode 17 miles down to Caslow, raided somebody's chicken yard, rode back 17 miles to Lardeau and gave the guys the chickens. If he saw someone doing work, they didn't have the right tools for it, he'd say, "Oh, I'll fix you up." He'd go and help himself to somebody else's and present them to the guy that needed him.
Stealing from the rich and giving to the poor, that was his motto. Well, he was a big man and had a real snow white mustache and hard, glistening, sharp blue eyes, just like ice they were, and a mop of red hair. Just as straight as a candle, even when he was in his 70s. He rode horses and he stole horses.
Yeah, he was a good horseman. He was a good packer. A big red-headed Scotchman. Yeah, walking around with his hat pulled over his eyes and always looking at his feet. He was a big man. He'd be 6'1" or 2, and he'd weigh 195 or 200. Strong man, real strong man. He was a packer. I don't really know where he came from. I've heard him talk about working in the railroad yards in Winnipeg, I think. But he'd spent a few little hitches in jail and missed a few, for just being foolish. Drink is what usually got him in trouble. But he was a pretty good head, just the same.
Well, I think he was an awful man, but he wasn't a bad old guy. I didn't know him when he was on the jump, but I knew him after that. I knew him about 50 years ago. And he used to call me the kid. I would meet him. He had a pair of eyes. He could look straight ahead, yet he was studying you. Fine-looking man. Fine-looking man. A real old Westerner. I think he was born back in Ontario in Glengarry. And he came to this country pretty early, and he drove horse stage on the Caribou Road. Anyway, Red, he used to steal horses. He was a good horseman. In the time of Duncan City, that's over on Duncan Lake, when they had a boom there, and there was hotels there and that. He stole a bunch of horses, and at that time the Great Northern was going in, and the CPR in there, the railroad. Old Red, he stole a bunch of horses across over in East Kootenay, and he run them up through Earl Grey Pass and down into the Kootenay. He sold them first to the Great Northern, and he took the money, and he went down to Castle. Was a boom town then, too. There was quite a population there. And he blew the money. And then he come back and he stole the horses again and then sold them to the CPR. That's what he did. And him and a fellow named McDonald discovered the Lavina mine up at Lavina Lookout. They got $14,000, which is a fortune those days. I don't know how Red come to be up in there, whether he was on the jump or hiding out. But anyway, he took his $7,000 and he went down to Caslo and he blew it. They had a big honky-tonk there. It was called the Comique. It was a 3-story honky-tonk. They did the drinking below and the gambling, and the women were up above. And that's where he unloaded the money in 2 weeks.
Red's adventures in prospecting led him to the honky-tonks, but his adventures in stealing horses more often led him to jail. And it seemed if he wasn't in jail, then he was just one step ahead of the mounted police.
Old Red, they were closing in on him, and the Mounties were crowding him, and they had a couple of Indians, trackers with him. By golly, he ran back in there in the clearing, and he started a fire, and of course, then he hid. And they went out, look around the fire, and feel around and see how quick it was. Red, he went back and stole their horses. And then he went into the camp, so I'm Red McLeod and I need another horse. And they gave it to him. Nobody ever argued a doggone bit. And he made her into Montana. Well, they couldn't touch him then. And he monkeyed around down, he got into a jackpot down there. And they were crowding him pretty hard. This was a long time back now. My golly, he was making for Alberta out of Montana. And they were crowding him, and he got the drop on the sheriff, and he got him off and took his gun away from him and took his horse and put the fellow away on foot, and he made her into Alberta. Well, they couldn't touch him then again. So then he made the big circle, and that was the time that he came into Sandland. He was a full horseman. And they were hauling there for some of the mines. I don't know what mine it was. And the Mountie come into the superintendent's office there, and he said, "Is a fellow named Norman McLeod here?" The fellow said, "Yes." He says, I'm looking for him. So, anyway, the men filed into the cookhouse. And this fellow said to this Mountie, he says, "Do you see your man?" He says, "Yes." He says, "I'll get him when he comes out." Red, he went right through the cookhouse and out the back door, and the next time they saw anything of him, he was in the Lardeau. But he broke jail for something or other in Golden, and by golly, he stole a horse there, and he just pushing the horse, by golly, till he had to have a new horse. He'd ride right into a camp. "I'm Red McLeod, and I need some grub, and I need another horse," and he swapped saddles. That's how Taddock Creek got named.
To tell you a story about Red, during this time he was in East Kootenay doing these things, and he'd been in jail lots of times for small offences. He only did a little stealing when he was half tight, and he was this sort of a man. If he saw you had a lot of blankets and he might go and take one, and he knew you didn't have any, he'd go and take and give you one. That type. And the only difference tight, he was ordinarily was all right. And this happened, he got into trouble somewhere in East Kootenay, and they put him in jail in Cranbrook. And they hadn't got enough evidence to do much with him, so they did a rather mean thing. They left the door open, or half ajar, and of course Red beat jail right away. He knew where he'd gone. Then they found him, then had him up for breaking jail, you see. And he went to his brother in East Kootenay, and they sent a policeman and an Indian guide to catch him, and they caught up with him up the valley somewhere near Bugaboo Creek, around that country, and they said, "Red, come on with us, Red, come on." Red all went down the road together, and they came to this little creek, a little creek which had a road going up it and a bank. And Red wheeled his horse up there, and out came his 30-30 rifle. Tatar boys, see, and he had the rifle, and they just left him. And that's called Tatar Creek to this day. And that was to give you an idea of the man. When I came to Caslow, he was a regular bugbear. The women used to say, "If you're bad, my Jimmy, Red will get you." When Red came to town, everyone took damn good care that their chicken house was well guarded, because he was an awful man for raiding chicken houses.
Red went up to Mrs. McDonald's and he said, "I'm going to have a birthday." And he said, "Would you cook I'd like to have some of my friends in, and would you cook a chicken dinner for me if I furnish the chickens?" So she agreed, and this time I was walking up the sidewalk. Mrs. McDonald was just letting into old Red, you know, and he was apologizing and being as gentleman as he could. And what had happened, he had got her the chickens all right, but she had just discovered that he had stole the chickens out of her chicken yard and cleaned them and plucked them and everything. He gave them to the cook, and she cooked her own chicken. She was just lighting into about that. She called him all the old scoundrels and everything. "No, Mrs. McDonald," she said, "no, I'm not so bad as all that." And he apologized and everything. And it was funny as the dickens to listen to him.
When the Mounties were after him, during probation time, and everybody was making their home brew, and stills all over the country. And I remember this very well. We lived in that cabin behind the house, up the big house. That's where I was born, and the kitchen was a long room. Red was, McLeod was up there at the time when the cops were looking for him. My dad was brewing his brew, but they had the kitchen partitioned off with a bed sheet or a blanket, and the brewery was in behind that blanket. And when they could see when the cop came up, well, Dad ushered Red McLeod in behind there, behind that blanket. Anyway, Red was hiding in there when the cops come in, and they asked for if Red McLeod was in the house, and Dad said no. Well, he said, "What's behind that blanket?" He said, "That's the bedroom. My wife is sick. She's in there. You just don't go in there." So they didn't.
I remember one time him and Sammy Luffman. Sammy lived in Hauser, and him and Red had a little pole job from old man Newcomen down along the river there at Meadow Creek, and Bob Matheson was driving team for old man Newcomen, and they got a carload of feed in. Bob was unloading it, and he said, old man Newcomen asked him, he said, pretty near got that unloaded. Yeah, he said, I said about another load. He has so much bale, hail, so many sacks, so stuff like that. Well, he said, you might as well leave them there, he said, because Red McLeod is jippoing down on by the river, and he said he must be about out of feed for his horses now. So he says he'd only come and take it anyhow.
Well, when I was about 14 years old, I was working on a fire up Poplar Creek. It lasted all summer, incidentally, and old Red was packing there. And there was more work than he could handle alone, and I started working with him, and that was how I got packing. Poor old guy, he put the winter in jail over that fire. He stole a bit of grub out of there and nailed him for it. I saw something in a book about him here the other day that somebody had written about him being an outlaw and all that stuff, but he wasn't. He was, I think, probably a kleptomaniac in his own right.
So I was in charge of a fire at Poplar Creek one summer, and Red got the job of taking supplies up to the camp, see? And I had one of the Brandon boys helping Red McLeod with the stuff, you see, kept packing it up from the store to the camp. And Jimmy came to me, the boy, he said, James, you know what Red's doing? No, I said, no. Why, he's going up a side trail before we get to camp, and he's got a great big hollow cedar tree there, cedar stump, and he's got it full of food. He's got all kinds of bacon and things. He takes a load up and puts a lot of it into the cache and takes the rest up to camp. And we had a little Irish cook called Paddy who couldn't read or write, and so whatever Red gave him, he'd say, oh, it's fine, we've got it, and so there's no... And so I heard this story, so I rang up the ranger. She said, a chap called Jimmy Robinson. I said, Jimmy, there's something going on here, that Red's got a big cache of our food somewhere. Oh, well, we go up to see, and Jimmy took us to it. Jimmy Brandon took us to it, but it was empty. Take it. Do you know what Red had the gall to do? He took all that food. He had sides of bacon, whole cans of meat, cases of milk. Oh, I had a lovely supply from him. He went to the forestry man who was running the speeder. We had a gas speeder on the track. We were allowed to run. He went to the forestry man and said, say, would you take my stuff down for me to Lardeau? He loaded the stuff which stolen from the forestry on their car, and they took it down to Lardeau for him. And they were after him. They knew he had it, but then he got to Lardeau. What happened was he took it there and rode it over to Argenta and must have hid it in the bush somewhere, see? The policeman came up. Red did a stupid thing. He had a six-shooter on him without a license, and the policeman saw it, put him in jail. And while he was in jail, we hunted the whole goddamn country to see if we could find that cache. And unfortunately for Red, in our hunt, we were going up the Argenta Road, somewhere near Hamel Creek. Someone saw a piece of paper fluttering up on the hillside, and here was all the cache under a big log. And if it hadn't been for the paper, we'd never found it. So then we found it all. Red got 6 months, but that didn't bother him at all.
Some people said that Red McLeod preferred to spend the winter in a warm, dry jail, but in his later years the trips to jail grew less frequent. Red's adventures led him in and out of the Lardeau for many years, but eventually he settled at the foot of Lavina Mountain near his old mineral claim, and he drew out the last of his years in its shadow.
Well, the only relative that I know anything about that Red had was over in Fort Steele, and he was Andy McLeod. And the two of them had quite a chunk of land there, Red and he. Well, he used to come back and forth all the time, or since the early days. About 1925, 26, somewhere along there, he come over and stayed. But he was well acquainted long before that. He was in Argenta early. Then he was at White's Ranch between Hauser and Argenta. I can't remember whether he had any roots at all.
He lived up at Hauser for a long time, and then people wanted to get rid of him, so they had a mill there, sawmill owners cut lumber and they delivered it down here to Argenta. Well, and then they got somebody here to volunteer to build the place for him. He didn't bother anyone, but he still, even when he was here, he would get himself into trouble. He'd steal from the rich and give to the poor.
George McGinnis donated enough lumber and hauled it down to Argenta. Well, they built that shack for him. And old Jack, that's where he wound up his last days there. They used to call him the mayor of Argenta at one time. I've heard him called that. And he was always there on the boat, came in. While he was there, he got a saddle horse and he went up to Lavina to look for some ore that he claimed had been mined and never taken out. This was when lead was high. Of course, he's a man over 80 then. His saddle horse got away on him while he was prowling around, and he couldn't catch it. It was on the trail ahead of him, but he never could shortcut it to get it. And by God, it was summertime, and when he got on, he was just about all in. And they had to get the police boat up and take him down to Casville, and he withered away then. And after that, he wasn't the same guy. He was stooped. He didn't look rugged. He looked like an old man. But Red told me the last time I saw him here in town, he was pretty well broke down. He still wanted to go to the Lavina. And he asked me if I had any guns. I said, yeah. He said, I would like to have a gun. I'd like to go back up to the Lavina again. And he said to me, did you ever shoot a man? I said, not a civilian life. He said, I shot 3.